So it's just coming up to 8 minutes after 5 o'clock and it's time for Outside. I'm joined by a strategic leader, crime analyst and the former chief superintendent in the Metropolitan Police Service, Parm Sandhu. Now, Parm rose through the ranks from constable to chief superintendent. And on her journey, she gained experience of counter-terrorism, community policing and anti-corruption, forced marriage, domestic violence and more. And when she retired from the Met after 30 years of service, Parm was the highest-ranking Asian female police officer in 189 years of its history. Her expertise covers a number of high-profile cases, and she was involved in the internal inquiries into the investigations and murders of Stephen Lawrence and Daniel Morgan, and who was also senior officer on duty when drummer Lee Rigby was murdered in the streets of Greenwich in London. So I'm very pleased to say that Parm is in the studio with me and joins me now. Parm, thank you so much for coming in and joining me.
Oh, thank you for the
Really lovely to meet you. Lovely to meet you. Wow, what a career. So talk to me then. You have managed to reach these high ranks. A lot of people talk about institutional and structural racism and so on and so forth. What was it like in the police force for you?
I had an absolutely fantastic time. I worked with some wonderful people, some really fantastic police officers. There were individuals that made my life absolute hell. And they did that to other people as well. And that's where we start talking about institutional racism. But hand on my heart, if there was anybody else who's sitting out there thinking, could I be or should I be a police officer? I would say yes, because the positives of being in policing far outweigh the negative side of it. And for people of colour, you have to stand up for yourself and you have to stand up from within. You can't just be on the outside and try and change those structures.
Interesting you say that, because you said that that individual, certain individual wasn't very nice, and there are a few others who obviously behaved like that. But then you called it sort of institutional racism. And I would say to you, and from what you said, that actually those are individuals being racist, and actually perhaps it's not that structurally racist in itself. Would you say that that would be the case, or would you say that, in your view, the structure of the police force facilitates a level of racism?
In my view, and this is my view, the structure does facilitate institutional racism, because the structures aren't there to raise complaints, raise concerns and be safe. Because if you raise your head and you say something is wrong and it needs to be dealt with, there's a core of officers who will support each other, even sending you to basically Coventry. And Coventry's a nice place.
You sound
not
like
that
you're from nearby. Your accent, I can hear a twang of it there.
Yeah. So they will send you to Coventry. There'll be kangaroo courts. Your career will be blighted. And that's where the structural side of it comes in. Because if it was just individuals who could be outed, then that wouldn't be a problem.
So there needs to be a support structure, really, in your view, a support structure that would facilitate people to make those complaints if they were being treated
absolutely. And it has to have more transparency. People need to be able to trust in that process, and at the moment that trust isn't there, because if you raise your head, you then become the target instead of being the person who's supported.
Yeah, it's just easy for people to make you look bad, isn't it? Yeah. I've seen that happen to me loads of times. It always happens to me, but it's not usually to do with race, it's just in general. Now, I'm wondering then, so for you, why did you join the police force in the first instance? Because if you think about it, right, you've been in there for such a long time, that would have been a very tough time. And, you know, people around you, especially maybe your family, might say, you can't join the police, you traitor, that sort of thing. Did you get that?
I did. I was born and brought up in Handsworth in Birmingham. And when I told my friends that I was going to be a police officer, a lot of them did disown me. They didn't want to be associated with me. And I didn't actually tell my parents for 6 months. I actually got through the training, went to Hendon, stayed there, got through the training, told my parents I was doing a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday job. And it was only after I'd finished my training and I knew that I'd made it that I actually told my parents. So there was that anti-police feeling back in the day. I mean, that was over 30 years ago. And there was that anti-police feeling. And I was determined to challenge it. I was determined to make a difference.
And you've been in the force now for you were in it for 30 years or so,
yes.
For 3 decades, which is a long time to do anything really. And throughout that time, you've dealt with some really high-profile cases, haven't you? I mean, Talk to me about. Obviously, you worked on the Steve Lawrence case. I mean, that must have been awful.
I was involved in the public inquiry, which was looking at how the investigation was dealt with and how it was what happened at the end of it, whether it was done properly. And I have to say that there are a number of people who have influenced policing, and it took the tragic murder of Stephen Lawrence and his parents' fight for justice that made a huge difference in policing and an improvement. Because when that Macpherson report came out in 1999, the police service did change, and it did change for the better, in that there were a huge number of improvements, and policing almost became acceptable as a career.
And hopefully, I mean, I think it's a pretty good career, isn't it, really? And they're being more open and welcoming to, because I remember when I was young, you had to be 6 foot tall and all this thing for the men police officers and so on and so forth, but they seem to be a lot more accepting. And what about because I used to live around to the Greenwich area, and I'd just literally left at that point when the drummer Lee Rigby was murdered on the streets of Greenwich. I know that you were a senior officer on duty at the time for that. I mean, that must have been quite difficult to deal with. It
was difficult for me to deal with, and also my police colleagues, but it was also difficult for the local community, because the community there were very protective about their own families, their own communities. And then after the murder of Lee Rigby, there were outsiders coming who were there to cause trouble. There were marches, there were all sorts, but that affected the local community, and it was about everybody pulling together. And those two individuals who committed those crimes, they didn't represent the community or anybody, normal. But the community, the local community, did have to go through a lot just after the murder. Now
let's move on to some other stuff that you've done, because you've written a book, Black and Blue. Talk to me about the book.
I met somebody through some charity work, my co-author Stuart Preble, who kept saying, "Oh, you've got to write a book, you've got to write a book." And in the end, he persuaded me to talk to him about my experiences, and then we wrote the book together. Because for me, it was quite cathartic, because some of the incidents are awful. You deal with, dead babies, dead families, all sorts of awful things that I won't even go into. But you come across some really lovely people. And when you can give them a little bit of a leg up or a little bit of help when they're in crisis, it makes it worthwhile. So I had that long discussion over 3 years with Stuart. We managed to get it into book format, and it really was a way for me to open up the different boxes of my life and share those. And if there's somebody reading that book who thinks she came from here and she got to there and it makes a difference, then I would be so pleased about that. I really would.
So it's called Black and Blue, One Woman's Story of Policing and Prejudice, and you wrote it in June 2021. Sounds great. Sounds like a fascinating read. Other things you're involved in: I know you're an executive, a member of the Women's Interfaith Forum, and also an ambassador for the Sharan Project for vulnerable women and children. How did you get involved in those things, and why?
The reason that I got involved was because when I was 15, I actually had a forced marriage. So by the time I was 16, I was already married.
Right.
By the time I was 20, I was a single parent, and I had escaped an abusive marriage and come up to London. And it was because of my past experiences and then almost reinventing myself that I wanted to contribute. I wanted to be part of it. And a lovely lady called Lady Gilda Levy is the managing director of the Women's Interfaith Network. And another lovely lady, Polly, is the CEO of the Sharan Project, and that's a refuge and also an advice centre for women who are fleeing domestic violence. So it was important for me to do that little bit of paying back, because people had helped me, and it was only because I had very strong women who intervened at various points in my life who helped me, and I just wanted to make sure that I could just give a little back. I could never be as good as they were, but I could try.
What are you up to right now, then, your main things that you're doing?
I'm doing a little bit of media work, but I'm also trying to influence policing for the better. I think it's important that with my experiences, I share those experiences, not only to help people who are making that difficult decision whether or not to join the organisation, but I'm also mentoring people who are already in the organisation. But I do want to have my voice heard so that policing can change and be properly more representative of all of our communities.
So what would you say to somebody who wants to join the police force, in particular women, because they might be put off by it? What would you say to them?
I would say it's a fantastic experience, absolutely amazing time, really wonderful, dedicated police officers, and go for it. Absolutely go for it.
Well, Parm, Sandhu, it's so good to talk to you. Really interesting to hear your story. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming to join me. Fabulous, right? That is, of course, Parm Sandhu. That was Outside. She's a very inspirational woman, and she's done a lot for the Metropolitan Police.